Every night at exactly 3 a.m., the whistling stranger walks the streets of our town. No one really knows who he is, or what he is, or even what he looks like. We don't really talk about him other than in hushed whispers. The whistling stranger is kind of our town's open secret. He's been wandering the streets late at night for as long as anyone can remember. Even the old-timers remember him from their childhoods. The story goes that when the town was founded, the nearby watering hole was poisoned. Then the whistling man arrived, and the water was cleansed. And not only that, but the crops were abundant. The kids were born strong, and money was always there when folks needed it. The whistling stranger brought them luck and success. As long as he was allowed to walk through town every night, they would have luck, success, and happiness. He apparently only gave them 2 rules: don't look at him, and don't follow him. And so that's how it went. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., those of us who were unfortunate enough to be awake draw our blinds tightly closed and squeeze our eyes shut as the happy whistling tune floats through the air, accompanied by the confusing and sickening sound of metal and stone being dragged through the street. The whistling always sounds like it is coming from everywhere at once, but the dragging only ever sounds like it is behind you. It lasts about an hour, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. But it starts suddenly and it ends suddenly. The silence that bookends the visits from the whistling stranger is always so eerie and uncomfortable. It's almost like the night itself is holding its breath, waiting for him to leave. When we were kids, we would have sleepovers, and after our parents went to bed, we would quietly stay up to listen for the whistling stranger. We would breathe as quietly as we could for the entire hour, as if he would hear us and come into our homes and find us awake. The hauntingly upbeat tune was burned into our memories. It was such a happy song, but for some reason, it still filled anyone who heard it with so much dread. It was as if death itself sang you a lullaby and brushed your cheek as it passed by. The bravest of us would keep our eyes open during the whistling hour, but we never dared to look outside. As we got a bit older, into our preteens, we would dare each other to look outside or go into the street and try to find him. No one ever took it that far. No one completed the dare. No one except Oscar. It was August, a few weeks before school started and a few weeks after my birthday. My favorite time of year. I had just turned 12, and he was about to turn 13. Oscar and I were having a sleepover, one last big junk food-fueled video game bash before getting back into the school year schedule. We had planned to stay up all night until the sun came up and end our day the same way we started it, with my mom's world-famous chocolate chip Mickey Mouse pancakes. When the whistling hour arrived, those all too familiar chills went down my spine, and they almost made me laugh. I peeked over at Oscar, who was wide-eyed and smiling. He loved the feeling of being afraid. He was one of those kids who saw every scary movie and went into every dark cave we found in the woods. He was bound and determined to find some paranormal entity for himself. Of course, the whistling stranger was off limits. We didn't know what would happen to us, but we were fairly certain we didn't want to find out. Or so I thought. Oscar nudged me to start the game. He dared me to look out the window. I swore I wouldn't. He called me a wimp. I dared him. And to my horror, he stood up and slowly pried 2 blinds apart and looked outside. He said there was nothing there. He said he didn't know if the whistling stranger was even real and that it might be something adults told kids to keep them in their beds at night. But what about the sounds? I asked. The whistling, the dragging, the fear. He shrugged and said there were speakers all over town and that maybe they set them off from town hall or something to keep up the illusion. I might have gotten up and looked for myself at that point if a loud thud had not shaken the wall of my bedroom just then. The whistling continued, but the dragging sounds stopped. I could hear ragged breathing just outside and sniffing, like a bloodhound picking up the scent. After a moment, there was a satisfied groan, and the sounds returned to their unnerving normal. I was paralyzed in fear. Oscar, however, was invigorated. "I'm going outside," he said excitedly. He ran out of my room to the front door, yanking it open and running outside. This broke me from my fearful trance, and I ran after him, pleading for him to stop in the loudest whisper I could muster. When I reached the door, Oscar was gone. Or rather, he was out of sight. I could, unfortunately, still hear him. I could also hear the dragging sound. The whistling, however, had stopped entirely. Oscar was begging. "Please, please, no," he said through tears and blubbering lips. "I won't do it again. I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please don't." In the middle of his sentence, a sick, wet slurp and crunch interrupted him. I could only imagine what had happened to my friend. Had he been bitten in half, eaten whole? Had his head been cut off to be dragged behind the whistling stranger? These scenarios and more raced through my head as I heard what I could only assume was the bloody, gruesome murder and dismemberment of my stupidly brave friend. And then I heard the dragging get closer. I squeezed my eyes shut and began to cry silently. I was shaking so badly I may have wet myself. I was terrified, standing at the open front door of my home. I felt the whistling stranger lean in close and sniff my hair and my neck. He stroked my arm. I whimpered, certain these were my final moments. I felt him open his mouth and his sharp teeth pressed against my skin. He pulled back sharply as if preparing to take a large chunk out of my arm, but then, nothing. I felt him pull back and heard him growl. He spoke in an unearthly, graveled voice. "Pity." I stood there with my eyes squeezed shut until I saw the sun rise through my eyelids. I raced back inside to my bed. When my parents asked me what happened to Oscar, I could only say, "The whistles." Over the years, I learned that there was one more secret command given by the whistling stranger. Anyone who looked at him belonged to him. They were the sacrifice for our good fortune, and it happened more often than any of us had known. I still live in town. I bought a small house on the outskirts. I am always indoors by midnight, and I have blackout curtains on all my windows.